Giulia Tofana ran a cosmetic shop in 17th century Rome that secretly sold poison to wives. She is credibly linked to the deaths of more than 600 husbands before the Pope had her executed. 600, not a folk legend, a number she gave under interrogation in 1659, and a number modern historians like Mike Dash and the Vatican archive scholar Craig Monson have found no good reason to deflate. The product was called aqua tofana, 4 drops in wine to make a man sick, 5 or 6 to kill him, slowly, over weeks, with symptoms that mimicked a wasting fever no Roman physician of the era could distinguish from natural disease. It was sold in glass vials labeled as face makeup, displayed beside actual rouge and skin tonic, and bought almost exclusively by women, wives of violent husbands, wives of rich elderly husbands, wives who could not divorce because divorce in papal Rome did not exist. Stop and notice what this actually was. It was not a murder, it was a service industry. A woman opened a storefront, hired chemists, trained a sales staff that included her daughter Girolama, and built a customer pipeline across 3 Italian cities. The men who ran the Roman state didn't catch her for 50 years. The reason they finally did was that one customer hesitated mid-pour, her husband survived, and he beat the supplier's name out of her. The deadliest woman in early modern Europe was, functionally, a small business owner. That framing, not the
You were taught implicitly that history's killers were men, soldiers, kings, conquistadors. When a woman appears in the body count records, the textbooks call her a she-devil, a blood countess, a witch, an aberration. The framing does a lot of work. It tells you she is the exception that proves the rule. It tells you that what she did was personal, deranged, sexual, sometimes supernatural, never professional. Never organized, never a business. That framing is wrong, and the historical record, once you actually read it, is embarrassing about how wrong. The women we are about to walk through were not lone freaks. They were salaried state employees. They were CEOs of distribution networks. They were heads of state who designed military operations that killed more people in one afternoon than most medieval battles killed in a year. The men around them knew. The men around them paid. The she-devil label was applied later, often centuries later, by chroniclers who could not square the evidence with what they believed women were capable of. So they called it monstrous instead of organized. In the year 54 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius died from a plate of mushrooms. The woman who supplied the mushrooms was named Locusta. She was from Gaul, she had already been convicted of poisoning once, and she was sitting in a Roman prison cell when Nero's mother, the Empress Agrippina, sent for her. Tacitus and Suetonius both name her. Both agree on what happened next. Nero took the throne. Nero kept Locusta on payroll. When Nero wanted to murder his 14-year-old stepbrother Britannicus at a family dinner, he called Locusta. The first dose was too weak. Nero personally whipped her in his private chambers and ordered her to mix a stronger one in front of him. She did. They tested it on a goat. The goat took 5 hours to die. Nero said, too slow. She brewed it again. They tested it on a pig. The pig dropped instantly. That batch went into Britannicus's wine cup at dinner the next night, and the boy was dead before the plates were cleared. Nero rewarded Locusta with country estates, a full pardon, and, this is the part the textbooks skip, pupils. The Emperor of Rome assigned her students. She ran an imperial poison school. Young men and women were sent to her to learn dosing, masking, and timing. She was, in modern terms, a tenured professor of state-sponsored assassination, paid from the treasury. She held that position for 14 years. When Nero finally fell in 68 AD, the new Emperor Galba had her dragged through the streets and executed, not for the killings, which everyone had known about, but for the embarrassment of having served the regime that openly employed her. Locusta is the cleanest case in the entire historical record of what we are arguing here. She was not hiding, she was on the books. The Roman state had a line item for her. And yet, every popular history of Nero will introduce her in a sentence and move on.
because a state-employed female chemist running a murder academy does not fit the story Rome's later biographers wanted to tell about the empire. That its cruelty
In
was
945 AD, the Drevlian tribe of what is now Ukraine killed a prince named Igor by tying him to 2 bent trees and letting the trees snap upright. Igor's widow was named Olga. The Drevlians, calculating that a widow was now a power vacuum, sent 20 ambassadors to Kiev to propose she marry their king. Olga welcomed them. She had a deep trench dug overnight in her courtyard. She invited the ambassadors to be carried in on their boats the next morning as an honor. They were carried in. The boats were tipped into the trench. The trench was filled with earth on top of the living men. The primary chronicle, the founding document of Russian history, records that Olga leaned over the edge and asked them, politely, whether they found the honor to their liking. That was the warm-up. She invited a second delegation of Drevlian nobles to a bathhouse to wash before meeting her. She locked the bathhouse doors and burned it down with them inside. She then traveled to the Drevlian capital, Iskorosten, said she would accept tribute and depart, and asked only for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. The Drevlians thought she was insane and gladly paid. Olga's soldiers tied burning sulfur cloth to the legs of each bird and released them at dusk. The birds, as birds do, flew home to the eaves and dovecotes and thatched roofs of the city they came from. Iskorosten burned to the ground in a single night. Everyone inside who survived the fire was either killed or sold into slavery. Olga later converted to Christianity and was canonized as a saint. The Eastern Orthodox Church still venerates
Báthory Countess Elizabeth Báthory was the wealthiest woman in the Kingdom of Hungary in the late 1500s. She was related by marriage to the King of Poland. She owned more land than the Habsburg crown owed her family in unpaid war loans, which is the detail that explains everything that follows. In December 1610, a royal investigator named György Thurzó raided her castle at Csejte and arrested 4 of her servants. The trial began the next month. 300 witnesses testified. One of them, a servant named Susanna, gave the number that the textbooks now quote, 650 young women dead inside the castle walls over roughly 15 years. The methods recorded in the trial transcripts are not the Gothic embroidery later writers added, no bathing in virgin blood, that part is an 18th century invention. The actual transcripts describe needles, beatings, starvation cells, and exposure of naked victims to winter cold until they froze. Most of the dead were peasant girls hired as servants. The last batch, the one that finally got her arrested, were minor noblewomen sent to her castle to learn etiquette. Killing peasants had been ignored for over a decade. Killing the daughters of lesser nobles was a political problem the crown could not look past. Báthory herself was never put on trial. A trial would have required the crown to formally seize her estates, and her family's lawyers fought that fight to a draw. Instead, she was walled into a suite of rooms in her own castle, not a tower despite the legend, her own bedroom and an adjoining chamber, with the doors and windows bricked up except for a slot for food and a slot for waste. She lived inside that wall for 3 years and 8 months. She died in August 1614, alone, behind brick, the wealthiest prisoner in Europe. Read the trial transcripts and the pattern is not a deranged aristocrat acting alone. It is an organization. She had a steward who recruited victims. She had 4 accomplices who carried out the daily violence. She had local clergy who buried the bodies in church ground for a fee. The operation ran for over a decade because dozens of people were paid to keep it running. The Blood Countess framing makes Báthory sound like a supernatural monster.
Belle Gunness was born in Norway in 1859 and immigrated to the American Midwest in her 20s. By 1908, she was a widowed farm owner outside Porte, Indiana, with 3 children and a hog operation. She also had a hobby. She placed personal advertisements in the Norwegian-language newspapers of Chicago and Minneapolis.
The ads asked for a financially comfortable widower of Scandinavian descent willing to relocate, who should bring his savings in cash to discuss a possible marriage and partnership in her farm. The men came. They were never seen again. In April 1908, the Gunness farmhouse burned down. Investigators digging through the ash found the bodies of her 3 children and a headless adult female corpse presumed to be Belle. They also, as they kept digging, found something else. In the hog pen behind the house, in the orchard, under the floorboards of the smokehouse. Body after body, dismembered, some quick-limed, some not. The final confirmed count was at least 12 men and 2 women, though local historians who have studied the missing persons records of Norwegian-American communities from 1900 to 1908 put the realistic figure at 40 or more. The headless corpse in the fire was almost certainly not Belle. The skull was never recovered. The body was several inches shorter than her known height. Sightings of a tall Norwegian woman with 3 suitcases of cash were reported across the Midwest for the next 20 years. She was never found. The detail to hold on to is the business model. Belle Gunness did not lure strangers off the street. She ran a marketing funnel. She bought ad space. She qualified her leads. Only widowers, only Norwegian, only with cash on hand. She closed deals. The newspaper ads were the top of the funnel, the farm was the conversion site, and the hogs were the disposal system. It was a vertically integrated operation. The total cash she is estimated to have taken from her victims in 1908 dollars exceeds—
Step back and look at the 5 together. Tofana sold a product through a retail storefront with a sales team. Locusta drew a state salary and ran a training program. Olga commanded an army and designed a siege weapon out of birds. Báthory had a recruiter, 4 operators, and a burial logistics chain. Gunness ran a newspaper advertising campaign and an industrial disposal site. Not one of them was a lone, deranged figure. Every single one was running an operation with employees, suppliers, customers, or victims qualified by specific criteria, and a revenue or political model that explains why the operation persisted for years before anyone stopped it. The chroniclers who wrote these stories down, almost all male, almost all writing decades or centuries after the fact, could not process this. So they reached for a category they had: the witch, the she-devil, the unnatural woman, the seductress, the hag. Those labels are not analysis, they are a flinch. They are the chronicler's nervous system refusing to record what was actually on the page in front of him, which was a balance sheet. There is a reason this matters beyond historical accuracy. The lone, monstrous woman framing protected the men around her. If Locusta is a freak of nature, then Nero is not the head of state who hired her. If Tofana is a witch, then the Roman husbands who beat their wives into needing her product are not part of the system. If Báthory is supernatural evil, then the priests who took her money to bury the bodies are not co-conspirators. The she-devil was not just—
You came here for a body count. The body count is real. Somewhere north of 1,500 dead across the 5 women in this episode, and that is the conservative reading of the surviving documents. But the body count is not the disturbing part. The disturbing part is the org chart. The disturbing part is that history's deadliest women is not a list of monsters. It is a list of founders, executives, and civil servants whose product happened to be death. The Pope hanged Giulia Tofana in 1659. Galba executed Locusta in 68. Báthory died inside her own wall in 1614. Olga of Kiev died of old age in 969 and is a saint. Belle Gunness, by every honest reading of the evidence, was never caught at all. The records do not show a pattern of justice. They show a pattern of inconvenience. These women were stopped when and only when their operations became politically embarrassing to the men who had been quietly tolerating them. Tofana ran for 50 years, Báthory for 15, Gunness for at least 8. Locusta drew her state paycheck for 14 years and was killed not for the murders but for the regime change.
So when you hear the phrase, the deadliest women in history, do not picture a witch. Picture a ledger. Picture a storefront. Picture a printed newspaper ad. Picture a tenured professor with an imperial appointment. Picture a queen leaning over the edge of a trench, politely asking the men buried alive at the bottom if they are enjoying the honor. The historical record erased these women as anomalies because the alternative was admitting that the killing trade, like every other trade, had women in it the whole time, and that the men around them had always known and had always paid.